Probably like most indie developers trying to create their first game, I would start with a concept of what I wanted and then try to create the game from that. Be that their next hit RPG or Minecraft 2, but in space this time. But before you know it, the game scope has ballooned, you're adding all these features you never intended. It starts out as a survival game, then switches to a colony management game, then back to a survival game. Finally, you lose interest and discard it to the graveyard of other barely started projects collecting dust on your hard drive. Well, this time, I thought I'd try something a little different. Instead of trying to create a game from an open-ended concept, I tried to create a game around a limitation. Before saying the limitations in which I create the game around, I first need to decide what game I want to make in the first place. Given that I've always enjoyed playing survival games, I think this is a good base to create the game from. Now, to decide what limitations to set for the game, I've decided to take inspiration from the little known indie gem called Vampire Survivor. In Vampire Survivor, the player uses a limited amount of controls to move the character around and make various choices throughout the game. The rest is done automatically. I want to take these limitations and see if I can create a survival game from them. Okay, before development starts, I should quickly discuss how I'm actually going to create this game. To create the game, I'm going to use the Godot engine, Godot 4 to be precise. I'm going to make the game 3D using Blender to create the assets. The reason I went with 3D over 2D is because I really shouldn't subject anyone to my drawing skills. Okay, now that's all over with, we can actually start making this game. Like the great game developer and part-time basketball player Michael Jordan once said, "To learn to succeed, you must first learn to create a moving box." It's a bit boring to just have the player as a moving box, so using my limited Blender skills, I managed to model and animate this character. And all things considered, I think this came out pretty decent. Okay, now that player movement is down, there needs to be a way of harvesting resources and combat with enemies, and this needs to be done automatically. You could accomplish this by using some kind of magic system or a gun held by the player, but like Amazon, I think this could be made more fun with drones. So here it is, and I think this somewhat resembles a drone. And this is what it looks like when you place it in the world. Okay, now, there needs to be some kind of way for the drone to follow the player around. Having the drone follow the player around like this doesn't look supernatural, and I think this can be done in a better way. To make the drone look a bit better following the player, I think we need three things. First, an area around the player in which if the drone leaves, it shall return back to the player. Next, when returning to the player, it should rotate to face towards it. Finally, it should dynamically speed up and slow down depending on how far away it is from the player. After implementing the follow area, it produced this. It's not perfect, but it works relatively well. Next, I added the rotation when moving towards the player, which ended up being a little tricky to implement due to the rotation going from 360 back to 0 after one full rotation. And finally, after adding the dynamic speed, you can see the final drone follow mechanic, and I think it looks pretty good. What would any good survival game be without a bit of resource harvesting? So that's what I'm going to add next. Well, after using all my Blender skill, I managed to create these two beautiful resource assets. Just look at that tree. Next, I programmed the drone to move towards any resource that enters the follow area, and then stop in front of it. To show to the player that the drone is harvesting a resource, I implemented this laser that can be shot from the drone towards the resource. Here you can see the laser just stationary in the world. The next step was to combine the laser with the drone and show it harvesting the resource. All I can say is the first attempt didn't go as planned. But after a few tweaks, I managed to get it working as intended. Next, I added health to the resources and damage to the laser. Once the health of the resource dropped below 0, it would disappear. To make the resource harvesting a bit more satisfying, I made it so when the rock is destroyed, it breaks up into smaller sections and is projected in the air. I think this turned out pretty good. After this, I wanted to add some kind of item drop that would be produced when the rock was destroyed. After a few failed attempts, I managed to get it working. Next, I needed to add these features to the tree resource. This meant saying goodbye to the old mesh and creating a new one. This is it working on the new mesh, and I think it looks pretty good. There's clearly some problems with the drone AI when trying to harvest the resources, so this needs to be fixed later. Next, I wanted a way for the player to pick up the item drops. So I implemented a system that sucks the drops towards the player and picks them up. Here is a little montage of how that went. Now that the pickup system is implemented, I added some basic UI to show you what you've collected. And finally, I added some glow to the laser to make it look a bit better. Now that the basics of resource harvesting are implemented, it's time to work on enemies and combat. To start this off, I put my blender skills to the test and created the first enemy. I went with a blob/slime and I think it turned out pretty well. Next, I gave the blob some basic AI, where if the player gets within a certain range, it will move towards it. After this, I added some basic enemy targeting to the drone, so now it moves into range and fires a laser at the enemy. However, I wanted the drone to use something other than the laser to attack enemies, so I implemented this plasma bullet to be used instead. After a few attempts, I managed to get it working. To make it look better, I added some explosion particle effects when it collides with an object. After this, I tried to get the drone to fire these bullets at a certain fire rate, and the first attempt didn't go as planned. After adding in a small fix, I managed to get it working as intended. Now it was time to try this when the enemy was attacking the player. As you can see, this didn't work as intended, as it kept missing the enemy. This was due to the drone shooting at the enemy's current position, meaning that by the time the bullet reached that position, the enemy wasn't there. To fix this, I had to make the drone take into account the enemy's current velocity, and use this to calculate a prediction of where it would be when the bullet would land. After doing this, it seemed to work pretty well. I added health to the enemy and damage to the bullet, and once the health of the enemy got to 0, it would disappear and produce some death particles. Finally, I added XP orbs to be dropped when the enemy dies, and updated the UI to show how much XP the player had collected. Now that the basics of combat down, I think it's time to work on a few small improvements that will make the game a bit better. I increased the number of resources the player could collect by adding in iron, copper and gold. These new resources can be found in small amounts being dropped by the normal rock, or in large amounts in these special rocks containing a large amount of each ore. Also, I added particle effects when mining resources, and the drone's AI was worked on considerably to make it a bit more consistent. Finally, the player's mesh was updated to add a backpack and a space helmet. Next, I wanted to add a mechanic that would allow the player to perform melee combat and also harvest resources. To implement the system, I needed some kind of tool that the player could hold. After a lot of thinking, I came up with this completely unique idea. Here it is. Some might call this a plasma sword or maybe a light dagger, but yeah, it's super unique. Next, I added in an attack animation, which automatically played when the player got close enough to a resource. After this, I made it so the blade of the sword only appears when being used and disappears when not needed. Next, I added damage that would be applied to the resource when the player would swing. This now enabled the player to be able to harvest resources by itself. Finally, I also made it automatically swing when the player was by an enemy. This then applied knockback and damage to the enemy. That's everything I have to show you for this first devlog, but if you did enjoy, please like the video and subscribe and I'll bring you more. Probably like most indie developers trying to create their first game, I would start with a concept of what game I wanted and then try to create a game. Fucking game?